Kevin Durso here as he joins us now on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. And, of course, you can watch him live on the live stream. There he goes. Kevin Durso is in the house an hour or so after the Flyers at the deadline has happened. Let's first talk about what they did do, Kevin. They moved Eric Gustafsson, amazingly enough, for a 7th-round pick. He's heading to Montreal. Michael Raffl is going to Washington. That is a 5th-round pick, I believe. So 2 minor trades today. They didn't buy, obviously, but it wasn't like they had this fire sale today.
Right, and I mean, here's the fair thing. They made the moves that I kind of expected they would make when I talked to you last week about it, and I basically told you to expect something today. This is kind of along the lines of the something I expected. I kind of thought Lawton was kind of hit or miss in that regard. They could have traded him. They did want to keep him, and it happens more infrequently than people think that a guy gets traded away and still makes the decision to come back. So if they really wanted to keep him, they were going to find a way to sign him, and they did. But Raffl was one of the guys who I thought there's not really much of a future here for him, so go ahead and find a way to make a trade, get something for him. And for Gustafsson, it's really significant that they got rid of him in this sense because he was basically 8th on your depth chart now. And if you have Sam Morin trying to get playing time, you've got 6 other guys getting playing time, and you also have the potential to leave the door open for Cam York, Igor Zamula, these guys with the Phantoms who could be coming up and getting some playing time, then really what's Eric Gustafsson doing here for the rest of the year, taking up $3 million of a cap hit? You eat the salary for the rest of the year, which is half of the salary they're retaining, and then get a draft pick, even if it's a 7th rounder, that's fine. You know, it is what it is, and you move on. It was just a bust of a signing, so you get something back for Gustafsson and you open the door for those players. So they did what they had to do to get the ball rolling on some things. It's really, about what I expected at this point in time. And then, it's really the offseason where things are going to really have to happen if they're going to make anything significant happen.
Right. All right. So real quick, they did sign Lawton, too. I mean, they gave him a 5-year extension. What's the message with that?
Well, I think Lawton's a type of player that they'd like to build around. I mean, he's 26. He's starting to come into his own, and he fits the bottom 6 role really well. Your problem's not really with the bottom 6 type of guys. Those guys are, to an extent, a dime a dozen. You can find guys like that all over the place, and if you have one you like, then build around him. That's fine. But and realistically, Scott Lawton probably took a discount here and gave you a good middle-of-the-pack price point at $3 million for the next 5 years that you can work with while the cap's flat, while maybe you get some relief on cap money somewhere down the line, whether the cap goes up in a few years or you free up some money. I think it's a perfectly fine deal because he fits the mold of a third liner, and that's perfectly legitimate money to give. It kind of fits the mold of the Oscar Lindblom deal as well. Good money point for guys like that. Your problem is the guys who make all the big bucks, and that's really where the change is. Somewhere in the line of that, that's where the change is ultimately needed, and it's going to have to come from somewhere in that regard.
All right, so let's get to that because I didn't think it was going to happen. Let me ask you this. You've been covering this team for, 3, 4, 5 years now. Time starts flying. I mean, God almighty. I have never heard any conversation about moving Claude Giroux. Not that I think he stinks, not that I think he's bad, but he's been here 14 years. It's almost like the Andy Reid situation. Like, okay, it's not working. I know he has a no movement. Has anyone ever approached him and said, would you be interested in us trying to work? Like, it feels like his name has almost been not mentioned ever at the trade deadline.
Yeah, I don't know that anybody's approached him, and that's fair. It's fair to question that part of it, that have they even floated the idea.
The guys have no trade clauses. One just got traded last week. They waived their no trade clause when they're in a situation that they no longer want to be in. The no trade clause is so that you can't ship me to Siberia if things are going bad. You can still say, hey, okay, you want to trade me, I'm okay, I will waive my non-trade clause.
Right, and the example you're probably referring to is Taylor Hall from Buffalo, who goes to Boston and basically admitted this morning, that was a deal last night, that was made, and basically admitted this morning that the no trade clause helped him get to Boston because he got to basically pick the destination, and that's why the price point was what it was. I think that one of the things I think the Flyers have an issue with to an extent is they overvalue their players. So whatever the price point would be to give up Claude Giroux, it's probably too high for anybody's asking price given the contract. And Maybe this is something you approach next season because it'll be the last year of his contract. It's not something you do with multiple years on a deal because if salary is retained, it's not helping you in the cap front at all. So that's probably why they don't approach it. But would you sit there next year if you're in the same position and ask yourself that question and say, you know what, if I have to eat $5 million, $4 million because it's half of his salary for the rest of the year, knowing it's going to all be gone at the end of the year anyway? Like, that's how it worked with Gustafsson today. It's a $3 million contract. They're retaining $1.5 million, but that 1.5 is gone in another month and a half. So what's the harm in keeping it for the rest of the year? You're not making any significant addition right now. So keep the $1.5 million and move on from it when the season's over. That's what you can do when a guy's in the final year of his contract, and probably when you think he's not coming back at all. But I don't know that's, it's just something that's not really floated with Giroux. I don't know why that would be the case. Maybe it's something that comes up next year now that contract's running out. But all those guys, really. I mean, that's the core that's getting questioned, and that's the grouping that needs to be addressed in the offseason a little bit. And it's like you said, it's not putting it all on Claude Giroux. I think Claude Giroux would be a perfectly legitimate player in this city and at this stage of his career if he wasn't focused on as still the guy. And like, if we focused on Sean Couturier that way, if we focused on Travis Konechny that way, it's a different story. But it's not. Claude Giroux wears a C, and that's why we focus on him the way we do. And that's the point.
It's not even so much. Okay, the C, it doesn't help, but it's the fact that he's been here 14 years with, quite frankly, not a lot of success, not a lot of team success. I mean, he really took over following the run to the Cup. So you're looking at 11 years now that they've gotten out of the first round once. So you are the face of the franchise for 14 years, and the franchise has minimal success. Allen Iverson got traded because the team went on a 5 to 6 year run where they couldn't get out of the playoffs, get out of the first round of the playoffs. They traded Allen Iverson, for God's sakes. Claude Giroux is a great player. He ain't Allen Iverson, for God's sakes.
Right. There's a couple points that I can make to this. First of all, one of the things I'll sit there and say is that this is what we talked about during the playoffs last year when the Flyers were down 3-1 in the series to the Islanders before they came back and got it to a Game 7. That Claude Giroux's legacy, both as captain and as a player on this team, is defined by the lack of playoff success. It doesn't matter how good you are in the regular season, the 100-point season he had a couple years back, anything like that. It doesn't matter at the end of the day because the playoff success is what does matter. And ultimately, one of the things that I've looked at throughout, especially when we were sitting here with no games going on for several months, quarantining, all that type of stuff, you start to look at the franchise a little bit. And I can go back to a point in time where Eric Lindros was the face of the Flyers franchise, but Eric Lindros was viewed in the same vein as Mario Lemieux and Mark Messier and Wayne Gretzky and as the next one of that grouping, right? Like, when you got that advertisement, it's Mario Lemieux and the Penguins against Eric Lindros and the Philadelphia Flyers. It felt legitimate to put those two next to each other and say, this is the heavyweight matchup of the individuals going against each other. When they throw Claude Giroux's picture up on the screen next to Sidney Crosby or Alex Ovechkin, it just doesn't hold the same kind of weight. It's not the same level player. And that's kind of the problem also, is that the Flyers do not have, they hope they do maybe in Carter Hart, but they do not have a bona fide superstar player that competes with the Crosbys and the Ovechkins and guys like that. So that's also how Giroux gets viewed as well. So that's the understanding that I have for why everybody is frustrated and why it centers a lot around Claude Giroux, because he's been here the longest, not just on the team, but in the city as well.
Well, yeah, and I mean, it's just, that, hey, we need something different. It's not an indictment that you stink or you're bad or you can't play. Claude Giroux has been a very good player. I wouldn't say that he was one of the, like you mentioned, he's not on that Crosby level, but he's on that next level down, and that's okay. This isn't ripping Claude Giroux. It's just, hey, maybe a change of scenery for everybody would be a welcome thing. Now, guy like Voracek, different situation. Nobody wants Voracek. Giroux might have some takers as, hey, we could have a third-line veteran center who, is a pretty good player still, and he had 1 year, $5 million on the deal, so we get him for another year. He's not a rental. Voracek, you're not trading because, quite frankly, nobody wants him.
Well, that was part of the problem going into the deadline, quite honestly. I mean, at the end of the day, the reason Michael Raffl and Eric Gustafsson are the two guys that go are because they're on expiring contracts, and it's really no harm, no foul at the end. I mean, let's put it this way. The Flyers traded last year to get Derek Grant and Nate Thompson for half of a year, and then they were back with either a different team. Derek Grant went back to Anaheim after the season was over, so it really wasn't much of anything. They were here for half a year, and that was the end of that. That's how Washington could be viewing Michael Raffl, and that's how Montreal can be viewing Eric Gustafsson. And it's not that big of a deal to give up a low-end asset to get their services for half of a season. That's why I think that Giroux could be a guy who you think about next year if you don't have anything in terms of a contract in place for him moving forward, because that's when teams start to think about it. If you make an offer where you involve salary retention in that and say you're not going to have the cap hit of $8 million on your books, it'll be $4 million, and you get him for the rest of the year for a playoff push, if that's the position that the Flyers are not in and another team is, then I do think you explore it, and I think you try to entice Giroux with that as well. This could be your shot to win. But in terms of the rest of it, like whether it's for cap reasons, whether it's for the contract, whether it's for anything like that, they don't have desirable players, because I think more and more you saw in March and early April so far, you see guys who make the same mistakes over and over again, and it's defined this team. And when they lose a game like they did on Sunday, or lose games like they have previously, whether you pick the other Buffalo game, pick some of the other bad losses they've had, the 2 to the Rangers, the 1 to the Islanders last month, it shows up really poorly when you look at the other players out there and you see how they're competitive and how they could be of service to a team that makes the playoffs. I don't think anybody wants the Flyers players for the money they make and for what the Flyers want back, and that's the big problem.
Let me ask you this. I asked this question earlier. Ed Snyder was the Flyers. You definitively knew who was making the calls. In terms of Chuck Fletcher would have to call Ed Snyder and say, hey, I got to trade. Is that okay? Who's in charge now?
It's a great question. I'm glad you brought it up, and I'm glad that you mentioned it at the top of the show, because it's something I've been prepared to talk about for a little bit. Because when the Flyers lost 9-0 to the Rangers a little while back, I kind of, as a reporter, needed to hear from the GM at that point. Hearing from the coach after every game was not enough anymore. The next guy above the coach needs to talk about how this was unacceptable, can't happen, all that type of stuff. When it happened again a week later and they lost 8-3 to the Rangers, then they lose 6-1 to the Islanders, then 6-1 to Buffalo, things like that. Now I want to hear from the next guy in line too, because that's really going above and beyond. And that guy is Dave Scott. He's the guy who is the chairman, and I make that reference very, sarcastically to an extent, because we never really hear from him.
I couldn't pick Dave Scott out of a lineup.
Right. And basically, the Flyers are owned by Comcast. And basically what that is it's a business that is owning a franchise. So realistically, part of the problem with that is that Ed Snyder used to pour his heart and soul into the Flyers. Winning was everything. And when the time came, he would step up and basically sign off on the move. Go get this guy, sign this free agent, make this trade, shake it up, do whatever you have to do. And he was a presence. They don't have an ownership presence at this point, and that's not to say every team needs to, but that's what the Flyers were built on. And now you are having basically everything that they do is revolving around whether or not basically they make a profit, kind of, is what it is. And if the seats are still full and the ratings are still good and they're selling the merchandise and people pay for parking and people are paying for food and drink at the games and they're making money, then they're okay, because it's a business running a franchise and they're making money. It's okay, because the other part of it is, as I mentioned to you last week, maybe half the building was full when Boston came into town, and there was a lot of Bruins fans there. They don't care that it's Bruins fans filling the seats. The seats are full. There are people paying for tickets. Mm-hmm. So they're still getting what they want, and it really takes away from everything that the whole foundation of the franchise was built on, because Ed Snyder founded the franchise, and it was built upon blue-collar, hardworking people who put their hard-earned money to go watch a team that supposedly went out and worked as hard as they did. And yes, you can't be the Broad Street Bullies anymore. Fighting's not the prominent part of the game like it used to be, but you can go out and work hard, and you can go out and show determination and a willingness to compete every single night. And this team just doesn't have it, and it turns people off to that. And that's the thing. Like, the loyalty that they have to their players is betraying the loyalty that the fans have to the franchise. And that's really a big part of the problem as well.
Well, this is a team that was built very similarly last year, save for a guy or two, and they had that last year. We were excited about this team last year. Here we are 1 year later. Really, is there a second player that I'm missing that is not here that has changed the dynamics of this team so impactfully?
Well, I would say this. One of the guys who I've put a lot of attention on, or who I definitely find noticeable in all the wrong ways this season that wasn't last season, was Nick Aube-Kubel, who took another needless penalty in Sunday's game, by the way. And I sit there and I look at him and I go, this is the guy that you basically linked part of the future to. He's a young guy. He took a big step a year ago. And you didn't bother to re-sign Tyler Pitlick, who plays a similar role, but has been having a decent year out in Arizona. You could have had him back for a cheap price, and you opted to move on from him and say, we're going to let a young player come up and take on that role, and he hasn't delivered. The goaltending took a step back. The defense took a step back. They certainly hitched a lot of hope to young defensemen taking bigger steps this year. That didn't happen. They totally botched the Gustafsson signing. That was an unnecessary, needless signing that they made that never was a fit for them. And realistically, offensively, they're doing okay. They should be scoring enough to win games because they're scoring at about the same clip that they were a year ago, realistically. It just looks worse because they're giving up 2 to 3 times as many goals as they were from a year ago, and that's really where the glaring mistake is.
Well, the goalie last year was outstanding. He's not getting a lot of help. ESPN just recently did a executive poll. Carter Hart was the 7th-rated goaltender on that list. In other words, people around the league feel like he could still play.
Absolutely. And look, I know there's people out there that may be asking, who do you build around on this team? How do you start to get it in the right direction? Carter Hart's definitely number one on that list because he is a goaltender that has shown you the capabilities to play in this league and to do great things. And he still has that potential. He's a young guy, and he's, quite frankly, as Shane Gostisbehere put it a few weeks back, he's being left out to dry most nights, and that's not on him. He's trying his best to probably overcompensate for those mistakes. Sometimes it gets him out of position. It makes him vulnerable. He's found more of his confidence since coming back from that short pause. It's not that completely, but they're making a lot of the same mistakes in front of him. So it's hard to tell what's him and what's the defense in front of him. But that being said, you definitely build around him. I think you build around a guy like Sean Couturier as your forward leader at this point. Defensively, you've got Ivan Provorov, who needs a stable partner next to him to be able to really succeed, but he's a guy you build around. And I do think that there's some young players on the front end that you do build around as well. Like, I think Joel Farabee is a guy who has emerged, and you build around him as well and find a way to keep him as a central part of your lineup. But some of these other guys, you either have to find much more secondary roles for them. You know, we talk a lot about Jake Voracek. Voracek is the type of guy who, if you took the contract away at this stage of his career, would be perfectly fine in a middle six role and has been playing that role kind of for most of the season. It's the contract he has because he makes top-end dollars like an elite player would, and he had one great season that they signed him off of. So that's really what it comes down to, is you're paying guys for a few great years back when, and now you're stuck in a flat cap world.
Kevin Durso, at Kevin_Durso. I know Chuck Fletcher is speaking or, has been speaking, so I know I want to let you run to that. He'll have plenty more on the website, 973ESPN.com. 2 trades, 1 signing, nothing major, playing out the string, essentially. Tomorrow night, Caps, Pens, Caps, Islanders. That's this week ahead for the Flyers, and playoff hopes pretty minimal at this point. Kevin, take care, pal.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it.
Always great to see and catch up with Kevin Durso, our Flyers insider here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline.